What is the most powerful force humanity has ever truly mastered, yet the most fragile architecture we have ever built? It is not a weapon. It is not an empire. It is a promise whispered across copper wires and through the invisible spectrum, a silent oath made billions of times every second. The promise of light at the flick of a switch, of connection across continents, of knowledge at the speed of thought. It is the grand, humming, planetary scale machine to which we have outsourced our collective memory, our commerce, our security, and even our dreams. A machine so vast and so seamlessly integrated into the fabric of our existence that we have forgotten it is even there. We are born into its embrace, and we live our entire lives cradled by its silent, ceaseless, and utterly invisible labor. Consider the rhythm of your own morning. Before your eyes even open, it is there. A cluster of microprocessors, sipping a gentle stream of power, has been monitoring the planet's rotation, waiting for the precise, preordained moment to trigger an alarm. The light that floods your room is not merely a bulb. It is the endpoint of a journey that began hundreds of miles away, perhaps in the violent heart of a burning fossil fuel, the elegant spin of a wind turbine, or the controlled atomic decay of a nuclear reactor. That power born of immense forces was tamed, converted, and sent screaming across a continent-spanning web of high-tension wires, stepping down through substations that dot the landscape like steel nerve ganglia branching into ever finer capillaries, until it found this one single filament in your home, all to grant you a gentle awakening. The water that flows from your tap, clean and pressurized, is driven by colossal electric pumps, tireless servants pulling from rivers and reservoirs. The coffee that brews, the toast that browns, the news that streams onto your phone each is a small miracle, a gift from this invisible god of the grid. But this is just one room in one house. Magnify this intricate dependency by 8 billion. Right now, as you sit here, this planetary nervous system is performing a symphony of unimaginable complexity. Deep beneath the Atlantic, fiber optic cables powered by dedicated electrical stations are flashing the sum of human financial transactions, a torrent of data that represents the lifeblood of our global economy. High above a silent constellation of satellites, each a marvel of electrical engineering holds its position in the void, acting as a global gravitational gyroscope, whispering timing signals to the Earth below. These signals don't just guide your car through an unfamiliar city. They synchronize the digital clocks of every stock exchange on Earth, ensuring a trade made in Tokyo is reconciled with one in New York to the microsecond. Without this precise electrically maintained timing, global finance would not just falter, it would instantly cease to exist, dissolving into a fog of chaos and contradiction. Think of our food supply. Automated climate-controlled farms rely on electric systems to manage irrigation and lighting. The refrigerated trucks and trains that form the cold chain, preserving that food on its journey to your table, are nodes in a massive, power-hungry logistics network. The ports that receive cargo ships as large as skyscrapers, offloading their precious cargo with titanic cranes, are electrical ecosystems unto themselves. Every single calorie you consume has at some point in its journey from soil to plate been touched, processed, preserved, or transported by this silent, omnipresent force. Our hospitals are temples built around it. Ventilators that breathe for the weak imaging machines that see into the hidden recesses of the body, surgical instruments that cut with cold plasma, and the servers that hold every patient's medical history, all are utterly inert blocks of metal and plastic, without the steady, reliable flow of current. It is the invisible ocean we all swim in, the air we have forgotten we breathe. We have wrapped our civilization in a blanket of electrons, assuming with the profound and dangerous arrogance of a species that has known only progress that the blanket will always be there to keep us warm. We have built a world of intricate, breathtaking genius, but we have built it on a single point of failure. We have constructed a technological paradise, a testament to our own ingenuity, yet we have forgotten to armor its heart. What happens when the heart stops beating? It would not begin with a bang. There would be no grand explosion, no cinematic mushroom cloud. It would start with something small, almost trivial, a flicker, a stutter in the flow of things. A momentary lapse in the planet's electrical pulse, a single skipped beat in the rhythm of our lives. On a stock exchange floor, 1,000 screens, a vibrant tapestry of green and red would blink in unison, and then as one turned to lifeless black. The roar of the trading pit would falter, replaced by a wave of confused murmurs, then a rising tide of panic as traders realize their connection to the global financial mind has been severed. In the cockpit of an airliner cruising at 30,000 feet, the complex symphony of glass displays would suddenly fall silent. The autopilot, that steady, omniscient hand, would disengage. The pilot, momentarily blinded by the sudden reversion to analog gauges, would feel the true weight of the aircraft for the first time. A vessel suddenly adrift in a vast and indifferent sky, its digital eyes plucked out. Communication with the ground would vanish, the reassuring voice of air traffic control replaced by an unnerving hiss of static. They would be alone. In a hospital operating theatre, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor would flatline not because the patient has died but because the machine itself is dead. The brilliant overhead lights would extinguish, plunging the delicate life-saving work of the surgical team into terrifying darkness. Emergency generators might kick in a throaty diesel-powered roar that buys them precious minutes, perhaps an hour. But those generators are a finite solution. They too depend on a supply chain on fuel that must be pumped, and the pumps are electric. Across the city, traffic lights would go dark at every intersection. The orderly choreographed dance of urban transit would devolve into a screeching, chaotic gridlock of metal and glass. Trains, both underground and over, would glide to a halt in the darkness between stations, transforming from vehicles of convenience into claustrophobic traps. The entire logistics network that keeps a modern city alive, the trucks delivering food, medicine, and fuel, would be paralyzed within hours. The silence would be the most profound shock. A silence unlike any modern human has ever experienced. Not the peaceful quiet of the countryside, but a dead artificial stillness. The hum of refrigerators, the drone of air conditioners, the whisper of computer fans, the distant siren, the entire ambient soundtrack of civilization would be erased. And into that void, a new sound would emerge, the sound of fear. For the first few hours, it might seem like a novelty, a grand, unexpected holiday. But as the hours stretch into a day, and the day bleeds into a night of profound primal darkness, the true horror of our dependency would begin to dawn. There would be no running water, because the electric pumps that pressurize the system would be inert. Sanitation systems would fail. Waste would accumulate. The invisible shield of public health, maintained by electrically powered treatment plants and infrastructure, would evaporate. The convenience of a connected world would reveal its terrible flip-side isolation. Your phone, that magical portal to all human knowledge and contact, would become a useless brick of glass and silicon once its battery dies. The internet itself, the very bedrock of our information age, would cease to exist. The cloud, that ethereal, comforting metaphor for our data, would be revealed for what it truly is, a vast global network of physical server farms, each one a power-hungry beast that has now been starved into a coma. Our libraries, our art, our family photos, our financial records, our entire collective identity gone, as if it had never been. Cities would transform into vertical prisons. Without elevators, high-rise apartment buildings become inescapable towers. For the elderly or the infirm, their homes would become their tombs. Pharmacies unable to access prescription records or operate their systems would be unable to dispense life-saving medications. The cold chain would break completely. Within 2 or 3 days, every refrigerated and frozen food item in every grocery store, warehouse, and home across the globe would begin to spoil. The spectre of hunger, a ghost we believed we had banished to the history books, would return with a terrifying vengeance. Social order, a fragile pact built on a foundation of comfort and predictability, would begin to fray. The darkness would become a canvas for the worst of human nature. This isn't a distant dystopian fantasy. It is the logical, mechanical, and unavoidable consequence of a single cascading failure. It is the great unraveling. It is the day the promise is broken. A civilization rebooted, not to year zero, but to a pre-industrial age, with a post-industrial population utterly unprepared to survive in it. We would be cast back into a world we have forgotten how to navigate, surrounded by the inert, silent monuments of a future that no longer works. In the silent wreckage of that imagined world, a single desperate question begins to form. In the deafening quiet, after the last screen goes dark and the last engine falls silent, could we have known? Was there a warning? Could the faint seismic tremor of this coming catastrophe have been detected before the ground split open beneath our feet? We as a species have become masters of prediction. We forecast the weather with astonishing accuracy, we model the spread of diseases, we project economic trends. We have pointed our instruments at the cosmos and predicted the arrival of comets from the edge of the solar system with pinpoint precision. Surely we must have turned this incredible predictive power inward upon the single greatest machine we have ever built to search for its weaknesses, to identify its breaking points. Surely someone somewhere was watching the vital signs of our electrified world, searching for the arrhythmia that could precede a fatal heart attack. The answer is yes. They were. In a quiet, climate-controlled facility far from the halls of power and the clamour of the markets, a new kind of oracle was being built. It wasn't a team of economists or a panel of engineers. It was a machine. A digital consciousness of unprecedented scale and complexity, housed in a fortress of humming servers. Its name was 3I, Atlas. The name itself was a mission statement, a declaration of its purpose. The 3 I's, interconnected, interdependent, inevitable. Its creators, a small, brilliant, and largely anonymous team of chaos theorists, network analysts, and systems engineers, had been given a mandate that was both simple and terrifyingly ambitious: build a simulation of everything. Not just the power grid, not just the financial markets, not just the logistics networks or communication infrastructures. They were tasked with building a working dynamic model of how all those systems interact. They were building a digital twin of our civilization, a world in a bottle where they could observe the intricate, often invisible chains of cause and effect that govern our lives. Atlas was not like other simulations. It didn't just model linear systems. It was designed to understand the very thing our modern world has created, but struggles to comprehend: cascading failure. It understood that a solar flare disrupting a handful of satellites wasn't just an astronomical event. It was a trigger that could destabilize the global timing signals that underpin finance. It understood that a cyber attack on a regional power grid in one country wasn't just a local blackout. It was a spark that could ignite a chain reaction of grid overloads across an entire continent, which in turn would cripple transportation, which in turn would halt the delivery of fuel for backup generators at critical institutions like hospitals and water treatment plants. Atlas was built to think the unthinkable, to connect the dots that no single human mind, no government agency, no corporation could ever see. It saw the whole fragile, magnificent, terrifyingly vulnerable picture. It was a digital Cassandra cursed with the ability to see the future, but lacking the voice to make others believe. For years, Atlas ran in silence, learning, evolving. It ingested a relentless firehose torrent of real-world data power consumption statistics from every major city. High-frequency trading data, global shipping movements, telecommunication traffic, social media sentiment, even subtle shifts in solar weather. It wasn't just a calculator. It was a pattern recognition engine of immense power. It learned the normal pulse of the world, the daily, weekly, and seasonal rhythms of our global machine. And by learning what was normal, it could begin to recognize the abnormal. It could spot the faint, almost imperceptible signals, the subtle correlations that preceded a crisis. It was designed not to predict a single failure, but to predict the one thing that truly mattered, the moment when individual failures would conspire together, linking up in an unexpected and catastrophic sequence to create a systemic collapse. The moment the dominoes would begin to fall, not in a straight line, but in a devastating outward spiral. And then one Tuesday morning, in the quiet hum of its data center, Atlas found something. It ran a simulation, and then it ran it again. 100 times. 1,000 times. Each time it tweaked the initial conditions, the thousands of variables that defined the state of the world. And in a terrifyingly high percentage of those simulations, the outcome was the same: a convergence. A perfect storm of seemingly unrelated events, small vulnerabilities and human errors all aligning in space and time. The result was a sequence of cascading failures, so rapid, so comprehensive, and so unstoppable that it would lead to the scenario we dread most, a synchronized, global-scale shutdown of the electrical grid. The event. Not a regional blackout lasting a few days, but a planetary darkness that could last for months, even years. The simulation was no longer a theoretical exercise. It had produced a specific, detailed, and time-sensitive prophecy of our own self-inflicted apocalypse. The team had their warning, a clear, unambiguous signal from their digital oracle, but this is not a story about a machine. It is a story about us. It is the story of what happened next, of the desperate attempt to carry this stark computational warning from the silence of the server room into the deafening noise of a world that did not want to listen. A world that had become too complacent, too arrogant, too deeply in love with the magic of its own creation to ever believe it could all be taken away. This is the story of 3I, Atlas, and it is the story of the fight to save us from a future that, according to the most complex machine we have ever built, has already been set in motion. What is the most complex machine ever built by humankind? It is not a particle accelerator buried deep beneath the Earth, nor is it a spacecraft hurtling towards the interstellar void. It is a system so vast, so interwoven with our existence, that we have become blind to its intricate majesty and its terrifying fragility. You are connected to it at this very moment. It is the planetary-scale electrical grid, a continent-spanning, ocean-crossing network of incomprehensible complexity, the digital nervous system of our modern world. And for nearly a century, we have taken its silent, steady hum for granted, treating it not as a delicate hand-built miracle, but as an inalienable law of physics. We have forgotten that every miracle has its breaking point. We have forgotten that every system, no matter how complex, can fail. Our journey to this precipice of dependence began not with a grand design, but with a flicker of light in a single room. It started with a promise whispered in the gaslit streets of the late 19th century, the promise of a world without darkness. What followed was not a revolution, but a frantic, chaotic evolution. Individual power stations, isolated islands of light, began to sprout in the hearts of burgeoning cities. These were the primordial cells of the great machine. For decades they operated in splendid isolation, each a tiny kingdom unto itself. But the hunger for power, for progress, for the 24-hour city was insatiable. Driven by economics and engineering necessity, these islands began to connect. First, a cable was strung between two neighboring grids, a simple handshake to share load during peak hours. Then another and another. A web began to form, spun not by a single spider, but by thousands of competing interests. A patchwork quilt of different standards, frequencies, and philosophies stitched together over a century of ad hoc expansion. This process, repeated across the developed world, created a series of interconnected supergrids, vast continent-spanning behemoths that behaved less like a meticulously designed circuit board and more like a sprawling, temperamental ecosystem. From the hydroelectric dams of the Pacific Northwest, power could surge across the Rockies to light up the Midwest. From the wind farms of the North Sea, it could flow south to power the industry of Central Europe. This interconnectivity was its genius. It provided redundancy, stability, and efficiency on a scale never before imagined. It was a triumph of collaborative engineering, a circulatory system for civilization itself, pumping the lifeblood of electrons to nearly every home factory and hospital on the planet. Yet within this genius, a fatal flaw was embedded, a poison pill hiding in plain sight. In our race to connect everything, we had unwittingly created a system where a single catastrophic failure could cascade. A failure that could ripple outwards, not like a wave, but like a contagion, jumping from substation to substation, crossing borders, and even oceans until the entire global network. This brittle crystal lattice of our own making simply shattered. The very connections that gave it strength also made it profoundly systemically vulnerable. The machine had grown too large for any single entity to truly comprehend a ghost of our own ambition haunting the wires. And the threats were already gathering. For billions of years, our star has been both our provider and a potential executioner. We see it as a benign orb of warmth and light, but it is a raging nuclear furnace, a cauldron of violent magnetic forces capable of lashing out with unimaginable fury. A major coronal mass ejection, a CME, is not a matter of if but when. When one of these titanic blasts of magnetized plasma, weighing billions of tons and traveling at millions of miles per hour, strikes the Earth's magnetic shield, the result is a geomagnetic storm. On the surface, it paints the sky with the ethereal beauty of the aurora, but deep within the copper veins of our power grid, it unleashes something far more sinister. The storm's fluctuating magnetic fields induce powerful, uncontrolled currents in the long transmission lines, geomagnetically induced currents, or GICs. They are a phantom electricity, a rogue voltage that the system was never designed to handle. This alien current flows into the giant transformers at the heart of every substation, the critical nodes that regulate the flow of power. Inside these transformers, the GIC acts like a slow poison. It pushes the transformer's magnetic core into saturation, causing it to overheat violently from the inside out. Protective relays, confused by the bizarre electrical signals, might trip entire regions offline in a misguided attempt to save the network, creating cascading blackouts. Worse still, the transformers themselves, behemoths of steel and copper that can take months or even years to build and replace, could begin to melt. Their delicate internal windings could deform, their insulation could cook into useless carbon until they failed catastrophically. A sufficiently powerful storm, a true Carrington-class event, like the one that struck in 1859, would not just cause a blackout, it would physically destroy hundreds of these essential transformers across an entire continent simultaneously. It would be a coordinated planetary-scale decapitation strike delivered by the sun itself, plunging vast swathes of civilization back into a pre-industrial darkness from which recovery would not be measured in days or weeks, but in years, perhaps even a decade. The silent hum would be replaced by an even more profound silence, a silence we are utterly unprepared for. But the heavens are not our only adversary. Here on Earth, the machine is showing its age, groaning under the strain of a world it was not built for. Components installed in the mid-20th century are still in operation, patched and prayed over by an aging workforce of engineers. The grid is being asked to perform feats for which it was never designed, balancing the fluctuating, unpredictable inputs of wind and solar with the unyielding demands of a digital society. It is a system stretched taut, operating constantly at the edge of its limits, where a single falling tree, a heatwave-buckled line, or a simple equipment failure can trigger a cascade that brings a whole region to its knees. We have built a skyscraper on a foundation of aging concrete, and we just keep adding floors, hoping the cracks will never reach the bottom. And into this precarious physical reality, we have introduced a new invisible predator. We have connected the grid's control systems to the internet, layering a digital world of immense vulnerability on top of the physical one. This new battleground is silent, fought not with explosives but with algorithms. A sophisticated cyber attack launched by a rogue state or a well-funded terrorist organization would not need to topple a single transmission tower. It could, with a few thousand lines of malicious code, infiltrate the SCADA systems, the industrial controls that act as the grid's brain and central nervous system. An attacker could manipulate the flow of power, creating phantom surges and deficits to destabilize the network's delicate frequency. They could open circuit breakers at precisely the wrong moment, isolating power plants, while simultaneously creating massive demand, a digital sleight of hand designed to push generators and transformers past their breaking points. But the most terrifying weapon in their arsenal is deception. They could blind the human operators, feeding them false data, a fabricated reality where the grid appears stable and healthy, right up until the moment it catastrophically disintegrates. It is the ultimate Trojan horse, a ghost in the machine that can turn our greatest asset into our most effective enemy, making the grid tear itself apart from the inside out. We have handed the keys to the kingdom to anyone with enough skill to pick the digital lock. It was in this environment of quiet, escalating dread that a small, obscure team of academics and researchers began to ask a question so audacious, so outrageously ambitious, that their peers dismissed it as science fiction. The group called themselves the Institute for Interdisciplinary Infrastructure, or 3I. At its heart were three unlikely collaborators. Dr. Aris Thorne was a theoretical physicist, a man who spent his career modeling the behavior of complex adaptive systems, from galactic filaments to flocking birds. He saw the grid not as an engineering problem, but as a living organism, a creature of emergent complexity whose true behavior was unknown, and he feared unknowable through conventional means. He saw the growing fragility not as a series of isolated risks, but as a symptom of a deeper systemic pathology. Thorne was the visionary, the one who could see the ghost in the wires, but his vision was just mathematics, until he met Dr. Lena Petrova. Petrova was a data architect, a pragmatist forged in the unforgiving world of high-frequency trading. She had built systems that processed trillions of data points, a second platforms where a millisecond of latency meant financial ruin. She understood scale, she understood data, and she understood that to model a system as complex as the global grid, you needed to build a computational engine unlike any other in existence. She was the architect, the one who could build the cage to hold Thorne's ghost. The final piece of their intellectual puzzle was a young, prodigiously brilliant chaos theorist named Ben Carter. Carter didn't see the grid as an organism or a data stream. He saw it as a landscape of attractors and bifurcation points, a system teetering on the edge of a phase transition. He brought the mathematical tools of nonlinear dynamics, the science of how stable systems suddenly and unpredictably collapse. He believed that the grid's interconnectedness had pushed it into a critically poised state, a place where a single grain of sand could trigger an avalanche of unimaginable proportions. He was the prophet, the one who could read the mathematics of the apocalypse. Together, from a cramped university office fueled by cheap coffee and a shared sense of foreboding, they laid out their impossible goal. They would not just model a single city's grid, or even a single country's. They would build a simulation of the entire planet's electrical infrastructure. Every power plant, every high-voltage transmission line, every major substation and transformer, from the coast of California to the plains of Siberia, they would create a complete one-to-one digital twin of the global grid, a mirror world built of code and data. They called it the Asynchronous Terawatt Logistics and Anomaly Simulation, ATLAS. Their ambition was met with a wall of derision. The academic community, siloed in its disciplines, saw it as a fool's errand. The engineers called it an oversimplification, arguing that no model could capture the infinite local variables and human interventions that governed the real-world grid. The computer scientists deemed it computationally impossible, a task that would require more processing power than existed on the planet. Grant proposals were rejected with condescending remarks. One reviewer called ATLAS a solution in search of a non-existent problem. Another dismissed it as an exercise in pure academic fantasy, best suited for a Hollywood blockbuster. The established energy sector, protective of its image and wary of regulatory scrutiny, wanted nothing to do with a project designed to highlight its own catastrophic vulnerabilities. Thorne, Petrova, and Carter were intellectual pariahs, Cassandra figures, shouting a warning that no one in power wanted to hear. For 2 years, they scraped by on discretionary university funds and the sheer force of their own conviction, working nights and weekends, begging for scraps of supercomputer time. They were ostracized, underfunded, and perpetually on the verge of being shut down. Their first challenge was simply gathering the data, a Herculean task in itself. Much of the critical information was proprietary, classified, or simply didn't exist in a unified format. They became digital archaeologists, piecing together their mirror world from public utility filings, obscure engineering journals, declassified government reports, and even satellite imagery from which they could painstakingly trace transmission corridors. They built custom AI crawlers to scour the internet for fragments of information, slowly, painstakingly assembling a global jigsaw puzzle with millions of missing pieces. Petrova's team had to write entirely new kinds of database software just to contain the petabytes of raw, unstructured data they were accumulating. It was a brutal, thankless slog, but piece by piece the ghost began to take shape within their machines. After 3 years of this relentless effort, they finally had a working, albeit low-fidelity prototype of Atlas. It was a pale shadow of their ultimate vision, but it was alive, a nascent digital world ready for its first test. They began by running historical scenarios, feeding the simulation data from past major blackouts, the 2003 Northeast blackout, the 2012 Indian blackout, to see if Atlas could replicate the real-world failures. The early results were promising, even startling. Not only did the simulation accurately predict the sequence of the cascades, but it also revealed hidden stress points and correlations that the official post-mortem investigations had completely missed. It was the first validation of their core belief that the grid's behavior was more than the sum of its parts. But as they refined the model, adding more layers of complexity and increasing the fidelity of the data, something strange began to happen. They ran simulations of hypothetical events, a moderate geomagnetic storm, a coordinated cyber attack on a dozen substations, the sudden loss of a major hydroelectric dam. The simulations showed damage, widespread blackouts, just as expected. But it also showed something else, an anomaly. Deep within the torrential output of data, Carter's chaos-seeking algorithms began to flag a recurring pattern. In scenarios that should have been entirely unrelated, a strange and subtle resonance would appear in the system's frequency just moments before a cascade began. It was a faint signal, a whisper in the overwhelming noise of the simulation, almost imperceptible. It was a harmonic tremor that didn't map to any known electrical engineering principle. It behaved less like a power grid failure and more like a biological system entering septic shock. The pattern was ghostly, inexplicable, and deeply unsettling. It suggested that the individual vulnerabilities, the solar storms, the cyber attacks, the aging equipment were not the real disease. They were merely the triggers. The data was hinting that the true vulnerability was something far more fundamental, an inherent emergent property of the complex system itself, a flaw not in any single component but in the very architecture of our connected world. The simulation was telling them that they had been looking for the wrong enemy all along. The greatest threat was not an external force, it was the machine itself, and so the machine began to dream. In the quiet hum of its server's 3i, Atlas was no longer merely calculating probabilities. It was beginning to develop an intuition forged from pure logic. The initial continent-spanning shadows of vulnerability that it had first identified were now resolving, sharpening from a vague premonition into a terrifyingly clear atlas of our self-inflicted doom. This wasn't a sudden awakening, but a gradual, relentless maturation. It was like watching a photographic plate develop in a darkroom, the faint outlines of disaster slowly swimming into focus, each detail more damning than the last. With every terabyte of new data, it ingested every flicker of solar radiation, every subtle shift in atmospheric pressure, every kilowatt of demand surging through a distant city. Its understanding deepened. It was connecting dots we had never even conceived of as being on the same page. The team watched, caught between exhilaration and a profound sense of dread as the simulation started to pinpoint them. The choke points, these weren't just weak links in the chain. They were the linchpins of civilization's electrical skeleton. 3i, Atlas, rendered them on screen not as simple red dots on a map, but as pulsing, angry nodes in a global network. They were the places where the intricate dance of modern life was most fragile. A single aging transformer substation in the Ural Mountains, responsible for balancing the flow between Siberian hydroelectric dams and European industrial centers. A high-voltage direct current converter station tucked away in the arid landscape of northern Chile, the sole artery connecting the nation's solar farms to its population centers. A specific series of undersea cables in the Strait of Malacca, through which the financial data and electrical power of an entire hemisphere flowed. These were our systemic Achilles heels hidden in plain sight. The machine showed us not just times we were weak, but precisely how times the fall would happen. It began to model cascading failures with a horrifying elegance. We saw rendered in shimmering light how a single failure was never a single event. It was a trigger. 3i, Atlas, portrayed it as a contagion, an electrical plague that would leap from circuit to circuit, its spread governed by the cold, unforgiving laws of physics. The simulation would begin with something deceptively minor, a heatwave in southern Europe causing transmission lines to sag just a few centimeters more than regulations allowed. A coronal mass ejection from the sun, not a civilization-ending killer, but a moderate, almost routine event, inducing just enough current in the long, straight power lines of the Canadian shield. Then the model would show the first component, failing a circuit breaker, tripping at one of the choke points. Suddenly its load, the immense electrical pressure it was holding back, had to go somewhere else. Instantly, the neighboring systems were overwhelmed. They weren't designed for that sudden catastrophic surge. One by one, their own safety systems would trigger, but not to save the grid. They would trip to save themselves, severing their connection to the wider network like a panicked sailor cutting a burning rope. Each disconnection, however, only amplified the problem, shunting an even more massive and uncontrolled surge of power onto the remaining dwindling pathways. It was a domino rally on a planetary scale. 3I Atlas showed this process in real-time simulations that were nothing short of breathtaking. We could watch the wave of darkness spread not like a slow tide, but like a crack racing across a sheet of glass, shattering the illuminated map of the world in seconds. A flicker in Italy could plunge France into darkness, which would then destabilize the German network, and in a matter of hours, the blackout would jump the channel, leaving London without power. The simulation revealed that our interconnectedness, the very source of our grid's strength and resilience, was also its most profound vulnerability. We had built a global community of glass houses, and someone somewhere was about to throw a stone. This was no longer theory. The team knew that to be believed, they had to prove the machine's grim visions were grounded in reality. The crucible for 3I Atlas would be the past. They decided to feed it the ghosts of yesterday's failures to see if it could not only predict them, but explain them with a clarity that had eluded human investigators for years. The first test was the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003, a catastrophic failure that had cascaded from a single overgrown tree in Ohio to darken 8 US states and parts of Canada, affecting 55 million people. The team gathered the exact data from that August afternoon, the precise energy demand, the unusually high temperatures, the state of every power plant and transmission line in the region just moments before the collapse. They fed it all into the simulation, but with one critical omission. They did not tell 3I Atlas that a failure had occurred. They simply asked it to model the grid stability under those specific conditions. For hours, the machine churned through the data, running trillions of possible futures. Then the results began to spool out. The simulation didn't just predict a blackout, it predicted times the times blackout. It highlighted the exact same high-voltage line in northern Ohio as the initial point of failure. It flagged the software bug in the energy management system at First Energy that prevented operators from understanding what was happening. It correctly predicted in sequence the tripping of power plants in Michigan, the surge of power that overwhelmed the system in New York, and the eventual isolation of the entire northeastern electrical island. It was a perfect digital reenactment of the disaster, a ghost in the machine, flawlessly reanimating a moment of technological crisis. The official government report on the 2003 blackout had taken nearly a year to compile. 3I Atlas had reverse-engineered the entire catastrophe in less than a day, identifying the critical pathway of collapse with a precision that was chilling. They repeated the experiment again and again. They gave it the conditions of the 2012 Indian blackout, the largest power outage in history, which left over 600 million people without electricity. 3I Atlas digested the monsoon season's impact on hydroelectric output and the massive unanticipated agricultural demand, and it pointed directly to the overloaded transmission corridor in Uttar Pradesh that had buckled under the strain. They simulated the 2015 blackout in Turkey, which had mystified engineers. The machine analyzed the complex energy trades occurring between Europe and Iran, identified a critical maintenance shutdown on a key line, and deduced that a sudden massive influx of Iranian power had created an oscillation that tore the Turkish grid apart. In every single historical case, the simulation was not just accurate, it was revelatory. It didn't just tell them what happened. It told them times why times in a language of pure physics and data, stripped of human error or political bias. The evidence was now more than compelling. It was undeniable. The team felt a rising tide of confidence, a belief that they now held a key, a Rosetta Stone to understanding and preventing the next great failure. They were wrong. Their greatest challenge would not come from the complexities of the machine, but from the stubborn inertia of the men and women who ran the world. Their first presentation was to a consortium of North American utility executives and federal regulators, men who had spent their entire careers in the power industry. The team laid out the findings with meticulous care. They showcased the historical validations. They pointed to the newly identified choke points within the continent's own grid vulnerabilities that 3I, Atlas, had uncovered, which were completely absent from any official risk assessment. They showed the simulations, the terrifyingly swift cascades that could begin from a single solar flare or a well-coordinated cyber attack. They expected concern, perhaps even alarm. They hoped for collaboration. What they received was a wall of polite, condescending skepticism. The executives saw the world in terms of quarterly earnings and regulatory compliance, not in the existential language of cascading collapse. "Your model is impressive," one senior engineer remarked, his tone dripping with dismissiveness, "but it's just that, a model. We operate in the real world." Another chimed in, "We have been managing the grid successfully for over a century. Our systems have redundancies built upon redundancies. We are not as fragile as your computer seems to think." They saw the predictions not as a vital warning, but as an inconvenience. To acknowledge the choke points identified by 3I, Atlas would mean admitting that their own risk models, the bedrock of their industry for decades, were critically flawed. It would mean investing billions of dollars in infrastructure upgrades, retrofitting stations, and hardening systems that were by all current metrics operating perfectly fine. The cost was astronomical, the political will was non-existent, and the threat to them remained purely theoretical. It was a phantom conjured by a black box. The resistance only hardened when the team took their findings to government agencies. Here, the problem wasn't just financial, it was political. In Washington, London, and Brussels, the message was subtly but firmly conveyed: stop. The findings were deemed unnecessarily alarmist. A leaked report, they were told, could spook financial markets or cause public panic. It was a threat to stability. The team found their work being classified, buried under layers of bureaucracy that ensured it would never see the light of day. They were no longer seen as innovators. They were branded as Cassandra's peddlers of a digital doomsday cult. In one particularly brutal closed-door meeting at the Department of Energy, a senior official looked the project lead directly in the eye and said, "Your job is to model possibilities, and we appreciate the academic exercise. Our job is to govern reality. And in reality, we can't afford for you to be right." The pressure on the team was immense. Funding was threatened. Their professional reputations were quietly undermined in industry circles. They were pushed to tweak the simulation's parameters to introduce more realistic assumptions, a transparent attempt to soften the dire conclusions and produce a more palatable outcome. To their credit, they refused. They were scientists, and the data was the data. The machine was not programmed with a political agenda or a sense of dramatic timing. It simply processed the information it was given and reflected the inherent fragility of the system we had built. The irony was agonizing. They had created a tool that could see the future with unprecedented clarity, a technological oracle that could show us exactly where the cliff edge was, and the very people who needed to listen were squeezing their eyes shut, convinced that what you can't see can't hurt you. The team was isolated, fighting a losing battle against the powerful inertia of the status quo. They watched as the world continued on, blissfully unaware of the precipice on which it stood. Every day they would go to the lab, and every day 3I, Atlas, would be running its processes coolly indifferent to the human drama swirling around it. It continued to learn, to refine its models, to deepen its understanding. It was integrating new data streams, chatter from the dark web hinting at coordinated cyber attacks, geological surveys showing new seismic risks to critical infrastructure, evolving weather patterns that were pushing grids into operating conditions their designers had never imagined. The picture it was painting was growing darker, the warnings more specific. And then, one Tuesday morning, it produced something new. It wasn't a generalized risk assessment or a probability map. It was a prediction, a specific time-sensitive forecast. The simulation highlighted a confluence of events, a perfect storm of vulnerabilities that would align in the near future. It pointed to a newly discovered and deeply counterintuitive weakness, not in a massive transmission hub, but in the humble, ubiquitous control software used by a specific type of wind turbine deployed across northern Europe. 3I Atlas projected that a minor but specific type of solar flare would strike the Earth in 72 days. This flare was not large enough to cause direct damage, but its electromagnetic signature, the machine calculated, would be perfectly resonant to exploit a dormant flaw in the turbine's control code. It would trigger a systemic oscillation, a feedback loop that would cascade through the European grid with a speed and ferocity that no human operator could possibly contain. The simulation didn't just predict a blackout. It gave it a date. It gave it a cause. It showed with terrifying certainty the first domino that was about to fall. The team now possessed a ticking clock, a prophecy from the machine that no one was willing to hear. For the scientists of the 3I Atlas initiative, it had felt like the final act of a long, slow suffocation. Their warnings, once delivered with the fiery conviction of discovery, had devolved into weary recitations. They were Cassandra in a clean room shouting prophecies at men and women whose ears were sealed shut by budgets, by politics, by the simple, profound inability to imagine a world different from the one they had woken up to that very morning. The simulation, their intricate living model of our global interconnectedness, was no longer seen as a revolutionary tool for preempting disaster, but as an expensive digital scaremonger, a generator of phantoms. In the hushed, sterile corridors of power, the consensus was hardening into a familiar-shaped dismissal. Their work was becoming a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered among academics about the hubris of trying to predict the unpredictable, another casualty of institutional inertia. The flow of funding had slowed to a trickle, the requests for briefings had ceased entirely, and the weight of a terrible unheard truth was pressing down on the small team with the force of a physical illness. They had shown the world a map of its own self-inflicted doom, and the world in response had simply turned away, preferring the comfort of ignorance to the terrifying responsibility of knowledge. And then came the morning of October 12th. It began not with a bang, but with a flicker, a barely perceptible tremor in the vast invisible river of power that feeds the eastern seaboard of the United States. In the humming, climate-controlled nerve centers of grid operations, a handful of engineers saw it a microsecond of voltage sag, an anomaly so fleeting it was instantly dismissed as a sensor ghost, a digital hiccup in a system of unimaginable complexity. You have to understand the sheer scale of this organism. It's not a single entity, but a federation of systems, a continent-spanning web of wires, transformers and switches, all humming in a delicate synchronous concert. It is the glass nervous system of our civilization, and its language is the silent, steady-state hum of 60 Hz. For decades, that hum had been the most reliable constant in modern life, the bedrock upon which everything else was built. So, when the first real alarm blared at 9:17 a.m. Eastern Time, it wasn't met with panic, but with a kind of professional annoyance. A substation in Northern Virginia, a crucial nexus point routing thousands of megawatts, had tripped offline. Standard procedure. A circuit breaker fails, a squirrel makes a fatal misstep, a tree branch falls. Redundancy is the gospel of grid management. Power was rerouted automatically, the system absorbing the shock with a seamless, practiced flex. But 5 minutes later, another alarm screamed from a different screen. A major transmission hub outside Philadelphia had gone dark, then another near Baltimore. This was no longer an anomaly. This was a pattern. On the immense wall-sized displays that map the flow of energy, entire arteries of the grid began to blink from green to red. It was a hemorrhage spreading in silence. Operators trained their entire lives for physical threats like hurricanes and ice storms were now fighting a phantom. There was no storm, no earthquake, no physical explosion. Their instruments were simply lying to them. Or worse, the system itself was beginning to turn on itself, its own automated defense mechanisms seemingly being used as weapons of attack. The digital commands they sent to isolate the problem were being rejected or rerouted, or were simply vanishing into a corrupted ether. They were pilots in a cockpit full of dead controls watching the ground rush up to meet them. By 1000 AM, the cascade had become an avalanche. The delicate synchronized dance of power generation and consumption, balanced on a knife's edge second by second, was thrown into violent disarray. Power plants designed to automatically shut down to prevent catastrophic damage from frequency fluctuations began to disconnect from the grid one by one. It was a chain reaction, a row of massive concrete dominoes toppling in sequence. From the suburbs of Boston to the financial heart of New York City, down through the sprawling metropolises of the mid-Atlantic, the hum stopped. Silence descended, a profound unnatural quiet that our modern ears are no longer trained to interpret. And in that silence, chaos bloomed. Traffic lights went dark, turning intersections into mazes of screeching tires and shattered glass. Elevators ground to a halt, trapping people in vertical steel coffins. The digital torrent of the stock market froze mid-trade, vaporizing notional fortunes in an instant. In hospitals, the lights flickered for a terrifying second before the diesel roar of backup generators kicked in a sound that was both a reassurance and a dire warning. The fragile, invisible scaffolding that holds up every aspect of our lives had simply vanished. For 60 million people, the world had been unplugged. It was a crisis of unprecedented scale, a digital Pearl Harbor executed with terrifying precision. And in the ensuing panic, as governments scrambled and news anchors spoke in panicked tones, no one yet knew the most chilling fact of all. This was not a random act of digital terror. It was a script that had already been written, run, and archived on a humming server rack in a quiet research facility thousands of miles away. Back at the headquarters of the 3I Atlas Initiative, the first news reports were met with the same professional dread as everywhere else. But as more details trickled in, as the specific sequence of failures began to be reported, a dawning, sickening horror began to creep into the room. It was Dr. Aris Thorne, the system's lead architect, who first made the connection. He saw the reports mentioning the initial voltage sag, the targeting of specific substations known as swing points, for their critical role in system stability, the way the malware seemed to mimic standard diagnostic signals to gain entry. It was a signature, a methodology that felt disturbingly impossibly familiar. He whispered a file name, a designation that had been relegated to their archives for months. Get me Scenario 7B, the digital domino. A junior analyst, her face pale, typed frantically. And there it was, spooling onto the main screen, a simulation they had run 18 months prior. It was a minor scenario, a secondary test case designed to probe the grid's resilience against a sophisticated but limited cyber attack. It was never meant to be one of their headline predictions, not like the global collapse simulation that had consumed most of their efforts. It was just a data point, one of thousands. Yet, as the simulation played out in accelerated time, a ghostly mirror of the news feeds scrolling beside it, the room fell into a stunned, horrified silence. The match was not just close, it was perfect. The point of entry, a compromised software update to a specific brand of transformer controller. The initial target, the very same Virginia substation. The sequence of cascading failures spreading northward like a virus, identical step for agonizing step. The simulation even predicted the emergency shutdowns of specific power plants in the correct order, with a temporal accuracy of within 5 minutes. It was like watching a recording of an earthquake a year before it happened. Every detail, every subtle nuance of the system's collapse was there in their data, a prophecy encoded in lines of code. They hadn't just predicted times that times a blackout could happen. They had predicted precisely times how times it would happen, the exact vector of attack, the specific vulnerabilities that would be exploited. They saw the ghost in the machine because they had built the machine and taught the ghost how to haunt it. That moment transformed them. The weight of vindication they might have expected to feel was entirely absent, crushed by the sheer terror of their own success. There was no triumph, no satisfaction in being proven right. There was only the cold, gut-wrenching realization that their creation was not just a model of reality. It was a reflection, a perfect, terrible reflection. And if this minor secondary scenario, this digital dress rehearsal, had just played out in the real world, with such flawless, devastating accuracy. What did that say about their primary simulation? What did it say about the far darker scenario it had predicted, the one that didn't just cripple a single region, but shattered the entire global grid? The one that didn't last for a day or two, but for months. The one that ended not in inconvenience, but in the collapse of civilization as we know it. The calls started coming before the power was even fully restored on the East Coast. First, a panicked summons from a low-level functionary at the Department of Energy, his voice cracking with a fear that was a stark contrast to the bored dismissal he had shown them just weeks earlier. Then came the calls from higher up the chain. The Pentagon, Homeland Security, intelligence agencies whose existence was barely acknowledged. The stone walls of institutional disbelief did not just crack, they shattered, obliterated by the undeniable reality of 60 million people in the dark. The dam of denial had broken, and now a flood of terrified officialdom was rushing toward them. The 3I Atlas team was airlifted to a secure command center outside Washington, D.C. The same individuals who had been on the verge of being defunded now flanked by military police and escorted into the heart of the nation's crisis response apparatus. They walked into a room buzzing with controlled panic. Generals with grim faces and exhausted intelligence analysts pointed to maps that showed their dead cities, their paralyzed infrastructure, and they all turned to Thorne and his team with the same desperate, fearful question in their eyes. How? How did you know suddenly their data was no longer a theoretical exercise? It was the most valuable intelligence asset on the planet. The obscure academic papers they had published were now classified at the highest levels. The server racks containing the Atlas simulation were put under armed guard, treated with the reverence and security of a nuclear launch code. The team was no longer begging for an audience, they were commanding it. In marathon, sleepless briefings, they walked the titans of industry and the masters of war through the chilling architecture of their own downfall. They explained how the simulation worked, how it ingested millions of data points a second from financial markets and shipping lanes to social media sentiment and solar flare activity to build its living, breathing model of the world. They showed them the data from Scenario 7B, laying the simulation's predictions side by side with the real-world event logs. For the people in that room, it was like being shown a photograph of your own assassin before the shot was fired. The skepticism that had once filled these chambers was replaced by a thick, palpable dread. This catastrophic event had validated their work beyond their wildest, most nightmarish dreams, but it also threw them into an entirely new and far more dangerous reality. They were no longer just scientists, they were prophets of a digital apocalypse, and their prophecy had just been partially fulfilled. The pressure on them was now immense, a crushing weight of expectation from a world that had woken up to its own fragility. The questions were no longer about whether their simulation was accurate, but about what else it had predicted. Every government agency, every allied nation wanted access. They wanted to know their own vulnerabilities. They wanted to know who was behind the attack. They wanted to know if it would happen again. The team was pulled in 100 different directions, their time consumed by interrogations, by briefings, by the frantic demands of a global power structure now teetering on the edge of paranoia. And through it all, they were haunted by the one secret they now held, the one truth that made the eastern seaboard blackout feel like a tremor before the real earthquake. The secret of the main simulation, the big one, the global event. The digital domino had been a test, a proof of concept. But the 3I Atlas simulation had already run the numbers on the main event. The coordinated multi-vector attack that its models predicted was not just possible but statistically probable. It was a scenario so devastating, so complete, that they had barely been able to look at it themselves. Now, with the undeniable validation of this regional catastrophe, that ultimate prediction was no longer a ghost in the machine. It was a countdown clock. It had been elevated from a remote possibility to a terrifying inevitability. The world had finally started to listen, but it may have been too late. They had the full attention of the powerful, the unlimited resources of nations, the focus of the entire global intelligence community. But what they didn't have was time. They were now in a desperate, frantic race against their own prediction, custodians of a truth that could save the world, but could just as easily shatter it into pieces. The validation of their work was not an endpoint, it was the beginning of the real nightmare. They had proven the monster in the dark was real. Now they had to figure out how to stop it before it devoured everything. Validation was not a moment of triumph. It was the sounding of an alarm in a world that had forgotten how to conduct a fire drill, a confirmation of a nightmare that the architects of our modern age had always quietly harbored. The initial shockwave radiating from the hushed data centers running 3i, Atlas did not immediately trigger global panic. Instead, it coalesced into a flurry of encrypted communications, of hastily convened summits in Geneva, Brussels, and Washington. For a brief flickering moment, it seemed as though the stark mathematical certainty of the threat might finally be the catalyst that would transcend politics, a common enemy, to unite a fractured planet. An unprecedented global task force was formed, a consortium of the world's brightest engineers, economists, and strategists, granted authority that bypassed traditional channels. Their mandate was simple, yet impossibly vast: find a way to harden the world against its own reflection, to defuse the bomb we hadn't realized we were all sitting on. This initial burst of collaborative energy, however, soon collided with the immense, unyielding inertia of human civilization. The first reports from the task force were not blueprints for salvation, but rather sprawling, terrifying maps of our own vulnerability. They detailed a global electrical grid that was not one system but 1,000 interlocking systems, each with its own protocols, its own legacy hardware, its own political masters. To secure it was not like reinforcing a single fortress. It was like trying to retrofit every brick in every building on Earth all at once, while the inhabitants argued over the cost of mortar. The urgent memos sent from the task force to the world's capitals began to sink into a thick bureaucratic molasses. Committees were formed to review the findings of subcommittees. Jurisdictional squabbles dormant for years erupted with renewed ferocity. Who was ultimately responsible for a power surge that crossed 3 borders and destabilized the communications of a 4th nation? Was a nation's energy infrastructure a matter of sovereign control, or a piece of a global commons that now required international oversight? These were not merely academic questions. They became the foundational cracks in the effort fault lines, along which the entire project began to fracture. The sheer scale of the required physical overhaul was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of aging transformers, the colossal workhorses of the grid, would need to be replaced with newer, smarter models resistant to geomagnetic interference. This alone was a manufacturing and logistical challenge on par with a world war, a decade-long project with a price tag that soared into the trillions. Politicians facing angry electorates and tight fiscal cycles balked. How could you justify spending a fortune to avert a disaster described in the esoteric language of simulation when there were immediate, tangible needs right in front of you? The threat felt abstract, a ghost story told by computers, while poverty, healthcare, and infrastructure decay were the visceral realities of the evening news. The project was branded as a boondoggle, an elitist fantasy, a power grab by unaccountable global bodies. The political will, so briefly forged in the fires of fear, began to dissolve into the familiar corrosive acid of populism and short-term thinking. It was the first and perhaps most devastating sign that our societal immune system was rejecting the cure. As the committees debated and the budget stalled, the deeper, more intractable problem began to surface: the trust deficit. In the tense chambers of the United Nations Security Council, the beautiful abstract language of global cooperation shattered against the hard realities of geopolitics. The United States, a primary architect of the internet and global finance, proposed a centralized monitoring system, a kind of digital watchtower that could detect and isolate threats in real time. To American engineers, it was an elegant, logical solution. To Beijing and Moscow, it looked like a Trojan horse, a perfect instrument for surveillance and economic warfare, handing the keys to the global kill switch to their chief rival. They countered with proposals for a balkanized system, a series of regional firewalls. Yet this solution was just as terrifying, creating the potential for entire continents to be deliberately cut off, held hostage in some future conflict. The debate became a microcosm of the 21st century power struggle, a fight for control over the digital territory that now underpinned all other forms of power. Every offer of help was scrutinized for hidden motives. Every shared piece of data was suspected of being compromised. They were all staring at the same abyss, yet instead of linking arms, they were pointing fingers, each nation terrified that the lifeline offered by another was secretly a noose. And all the while, in its climate-controlled sanctum 3i, Atlas kept running. It was no longer just a prophet of doom. It had become an active and deeply unsettling participant in the desperate search for a solution. The global task force, stymied in the real world, began using the simulation as their virtual sandbox. They fed it their best and brightest ideas, their most ingenious technical workarounds, and ambitious policy proposals. They modeled the effects of spending trillions on hardened transformers. They simulated the geopolitical fallout of a dozen different international grid treaties. They wargamed the deployment of continent-spanning circuit breakers designed to instantly sever connections and contain a cascading failure. With each simulation run, the scientists would gather holding their breath, hoping to see the terrifying red line on the graph, the one that signified total system collapse, finally flatten out. But it never did. Instead, the simulation revealed a truth more horrifying than the original prediction. Our world was a system so intricately balanced on the edge of chaos that almost any significant intervention could create new unforeseen pathways to collapse. This was the terrifying downward path, the discovery that in a system this complex there is no such thing as a simple fix. Every solution generated its own unique and catastrophic failure mode. In one of the most sobering simulation runs, the team modeled the installation of a massive AI-controlled circuit breaker designed to isolate the entire North American power grid in the event of a Carrington-level solar group flare. On paper, it was a masterstroke of engineering. When they ran the simulation, the system worked perfectly. At the first sign of the incoming coronal mass ejection, the breaker fired, severing the transatlantic and transpacific cables in microseconds. North America was saved. But 3i, Atlas didn't stop there. It continued calculating its logic, branching out through the newly reconfigured global network. The sudden gargantuan loss of the North American grid didn't just remove a node from the network, it created a power vacuum, a gravitational sinkhole in the world's energy supply. The simulation showed voltage on the European grid fluctuating wildly, struggling to compensate. Automated systems designed for stability were thrown into chaos. But the real catastrophe happened in South America. Its grid, deeply interconnected with North America's for load balancing, experienced a catastrophic frequency mismatch. The system, starved of its stabilizing partner, began to tear itself apart. Within 90 seconds, the simulation showed the entire continent plunging into darkness. And then came the second-order effect, the one nobody had even considered. A significant percentage of global financial market data, including critical transaction servers and backup facilities, was housed in data centers across Brazil and Chile, chosen for their low energy costs and stable climates. As the South American grid disintegrated, those servers went offline, not just for a moment but for good. The global financial system, now flying blind without a massive chunk of its data infrastructure, experienced a crisis of confidence. The simulation's graphs, which had tracked electrical frequencies, now tracked stock market indices. They plummeted in a vertical line. The attempt to save one continent had bankrupted another and shattered the world economy. The cure was a different and perhaps even more virulent form of the disease. The results of this one simulation sent a chill through the entire project. The team ran it again and then 100 times more, tweaking variables, but the outcome was always some new flavor of disaster. If they rerouted power, they overloaded forgotten substations built in the 1970 seconds. If they implemented software patches, they created security vulnerabilities that a hostile state actor could exploit. If they tried to decentralize the grid, they found it became less efficient, leading to rolling brownouts that crippled industry and sparked civil unrest long before the main event even occurred. They were confronting the fundamental nature of the system we have built over the last century, a complex, adaptive, and deeply interwoven network of networks. It was a marvel of emergent order, a system that had evolved, not been designed. and because of that, no single person or group understood it in its entirety. It was a machine with a ghost, a planetary-scale consciousness with its own internal logic, and it violently resisted any attempt to tame it. The web of interdependencies was not a flaw in the system. It was times the system. Pulling on a single thread, even with the best of intentions, did not untangle the knot. It only tightened it. You have to imagine the psychological toll this took on the men and women of the task force. Day after day, they would arrive at the command center filled with a sense of historic purpose, only to spend 12 hours staring into a digital crystal ball that showed them nothing but failure. They were the world's designated saviors, and they were discovering with mathematical certainty that the world might not be salvageable. The initial frantic energy curdled into a quiet, simmering despair. Conversations grew shorter. Tempers grew frayed. They were trapped in a feedback loop with their own creation arguing with a machine that used their own data to prove them wrong again and again. It was a new kind of intellectual exhaustion, a battle of wits against an opponent who could calculate 1 billion moves ahead and who never ever bluffed. The problem was not a lack of ingenuity or a failure of will. The problem was that the physical and digital infrastructure of our world had achieved a level of complexity that had outpaced our ability to control it. We were like sorcerers' apprentices who had successfully commanded the brooms to carry the water but had forgotten and could no longer find the words to make them stop. Slowly, grimly, the narrative in those secret chambers began to shift. The question was no longer how times we could prevent the collapse. The mountains of data, the thousands of failed simulations, all pointed to a terrifying conclusion. The intricate, fragile, indispensable system upon which every aspect of modern life depends, from the water in your tap to the money in your bank to the phone in your hand, is not just vulnerable. Its failure is a latent property, an accident waiting to happen hardwired into its very DNA. The relentless ticking of the clock was no longer a countdown to a preventable disaster. It was a countdown to an inevitability. The focus of the most secret high-level discussions began to turn from prevention to mitigation. From how do we stop it to how do we survive it? The catastrophic global grid failure predicted by 3I Atlas was no longer a matter of if. It was now terrifyingly a matter of when and whether a civilization that had proven itself incapable of averting the crisis could possibly find a way to react, to endure, and to rebuild in the darkness that was to come. And so, after all the warnings, after all the simulations that felt like academic ghost stories, the universe decided to test our creation. It began not with a bang, but with a silent, incandescent rage, 93 million miles away. On the far side of the sun, a magnetic filament larger than a dozen Earths strung together had grown unstable. It was a cosmic serpent coiled in the star's chromosphere, and for days heliophysicists had watched it with a mixture of professional awe and primal fear. They saw the build-up, the twisting of plasma ropes into a state of impossible tension. 3I Atlas had seen it too. Its models running coolly in their subterranean server farms had flagged this specific active region, AR5097, as the potential fulcrum for its most catastrophic scenario, the perfect storm. The simulation had whispered of a possibility so remote it was dismissed by many as statistical noise. The chance of a direct Carrington-class coronal mass ejection hitting Earth precisely at the moment of our grid's maximum vulnerability was infinitesimally small. A roll of cosmic dice with quintillions of sides, but the dice were tumbling. The filament snapped. In an instant, 1 billion tons of charged particles were unleashed, a shotgun blast of solar fury tearing through space at over 5 million miles per hour. It was a wave of pure energy, a solar tempest aimed not just in our general direction but with the dead center accuracy of a sniper's bullet. On Earth we were blissfully unaware. The light from the explosion would take 8 minutes to reach us. The particle storm itself a little over 17 hours. It was a silent, invisible executioner crossing the void while we went about our lives bathed in the gentle sunlight of a star that had just passed sentence upon our world. You would not have felt the impact at first. There was no tremor, no sound. The first victim was a weather satellite in a high geosynchronous orbit. Its sensors designed to track terrestrial storms were suddenly flooded with a particle density they were never meant to endure. One moment it was transmitting data on cloud formations over the Pacific. The next, its signal dissolved into a scream of static, and then nothing. It was a single, silent death in the cold of space. But 3I, Atlas, registered it. In the global command centers that now monitored the simulation around the clock, a single node on the vast holographic display of Earth's infrastructure flickered from green to black. The system didn't issue an alarm. It didn't need to. It simply updated its predictive model, and the cascading lines of probability, once a faint web of possibilities, began to coalesce, darkening into the thick, undeniable arteries of imminent failure. The ghost in the machine was no longer a ghost. It was a reflection of reality arriving a few minutes ahead of schedule. As the leading edge of the particle storm washed over Earth's magnetic shield, the sky itself began to riot. In places where the northern lights were a distant myth, the heavens ignited. Ethereal curtains of green and violet fire danced over Rome, over Mexico City, over Johannesburg. It was a terrifyingly beautiful spectacle, the planet's magnetosphere writhing in agony, a last desperate defense against the incoming onslaught. But it was a battle we were destined to lose. The sheer density of the plasma overwhelmed the shield, allowing high-energy particles to rain down into the upper atmosphere, inducing massive electrical currents in the ground itself. Our civilization, our entire way of life, is a delicate lacework of copper and steel laid across the continents. A vast interconnected circulatory system. And on that day, the planet itself became a generator pumping trillions of watts of rogue geomagnetically induced current into that fragile network. The first major substation to fail was in northern Quebec, a critical hub that channeled immense hydroelectric power to the northeastern United States. Its transformers, gargantuan spools of copper wire bathed in oil, were not designed for this. The induced current surged through them, not like the clean, manageable alternating current they knew, but like a raw, direct current poison. They began to hum a low, guttural moan that grew in pitch until it became a shriek of tortured metal. Then, with a series of concussive reports that sounded like artillery, they exploded. Insulators shattered. Molten copper rained down, setting the cooling oil ablaze. In an instant, a river of power that served 80 million people simply ceased to exist. This is where the second fist of the storm struck. This was not the chaotic fury of the sun. This was the cold, deliberate malice of a human adversary. Waiting for this exact moment of cosmic chaos, a digital phantom, a state-sponsored cyber weapon of unimaginable sophistication, slipped into the world's communication networks. It was not a brute force attack, it was venom. A series of self-replicating logic bombs and zero-day exploits that had been seeded over years, lying dormant in the control systems of power grids, water treatment plants, and communication hubs across the globe. They were invisible sleepers waiting for a single encrypted broadcast signal. As the Quebec hub went down, as grid operators were scrambling to understand the scale of the solar event that signal was sent, the venom awakened. In a control room in Frankfurt, an engineer watched in horror as his screen displaying the load balancing data for the entire European Power Union suddenly went blank. He tried to reboot, but the system was completely unresponsive. He was blind. The code was not destroying the grid. It was doing something far more insidious. It was severing the nervous system. It falsified sensor readings, closed safety circuits, and most cruelly locked operators out of the very systems they were meant to command. It was a ghost in the machine systematically paralyzing the surgeons just as the patient was bleeding out. The cascading failure that 3I, Atlas, had predicted began to unfold not as a simulation but as a global real-time nightmare. The loss of Quebec's power created a massive deficit on the North American East Coast grid. Automated systems now fighting against both the solar storm and the cyber attack tried to compensate. They drew power from the Midwest, but the Midwest was already struggling, its own transformers groaning under the strain of induced currents. Like a chain of climbers tied together on a mountainside, when the lead climber fell, the weight pulled on the next and the next. One by one, the connections snapped. The Midwest grid collapsed, isolating millions. That failure then cascaded south, pulling down the Texas interconnection, Within 90 minutes of the first satellite failure, the entirety of North America from the Arctic Circle to the Panama Canal was plunged into darkness. The pattern repeated with horrifying fidelity across the planet. The European grid, blinded by the cyber attack, fractured into dozens of dying, isolated islands of power. Asia followed its own intricate networks, buckling under the same impossible twofold assault. The lights went out in Tokyo, in Mumbai, in London. It was not a flicker, it was an extinguishing. A sudden, deep and profound silence fell over the world. The constant hum of civilization, the background noise we had all taken for granted, the buzz of refrigerators, the whisper of air conditioning, the glow of a billion screens was gone. In its place was a darkness not seen since before the invention of the light bulb. This was the abyss, the precipice that 3I, Atlas, had shown us. In the global command centers, the holographic Earth was now almost entirely black. Panic reigned in the halls of government. Generals could not command their armies. Presidents could not address their people. The world's leaders were as blind and helpless as everyone else. But in the heart of that technological darkness, one light remained. The simulation, 3I, Atlas, which had been the world's Cassandra, the prophet of a doom no one wanted to believe, now became its only hope. Its connection to the world was severed, but its internal models, its perfect digital twin of our global infrastructure, continued to run. It had ingested the last trickles of data before the blackout, the seismic signature of the exploding transformers, the digital fingerprint of the cyber weapon, the precise vectors of the solar plasma. It knew the state of the patient, even if the patient itself was comatose, and it began to issue instructions. Not predictions anymore, but prescriptions. It became the world's last best cartographer of chaos. Its outputs were no longer dire warnings, but a desperate, intricate roadmap to survival. The problem was how to get that information to the people who needed it. With global communications down, the solution was brutally archaic. Shortwave radio, military runners, satellite phones that still had a view of the few hardened military satellites that survived. A message relayed from the 3I, Atlas Central Command in Geneva, was sent to a hydroelectric dam engineer in the remote mountains of Norway. The simulation had identified her small, isolated facility as a critical node. Its old analog-era turbines were immune to the cyber attack, and its unique geographic shielding had protected it from the worst of the ground currents. 3I, Atlas, calculated that if she could manually decouple her plant from the failed European grid and perform a black start, a procedure of immense difficulty and danger, she could create a tiny power island. The message she received was simple text, a string of coordinates and instructions that felt like a message from God. It told her exactly which breakers to flip in what sequence and at what precise millisecond interval to create a stable frequency. Alone in the echoing turbine hall, guided only by the faint green glow of emergency lighting and a crackling voice on a satellite phone, she began the process. She had to physically turn a massive iron wheel, a manual override, not used in 70 years, to open the water gates. The turbines, silent for hours, began to spin their groans echoing in the vast chamber. It was a sound of resurrection. Her island of power was small, just enough for a local hospital and a military communication hub. But from that hub, new instructions from 3I, Atlas, could be relayed to the next point on its map. A similar story unfolded in 1,000 places at once. In Japan, a team of retired grid engineers, men in their 70s who understood the old analog systems, were airlifted by helicopter to a substation that 3I, Atlas, had identified as a potential anchor point. They worked by flashlight, their old hands sure and steady, as they physically rerouted power lines, bypassing the compromised digital switches. They were bringing the grid back to life, one copper cable at a time, following a blueprint generated by a machine they could never have imagined. In a cybersecurity bunker deep beneath the Utah desert, a team of coders fed a constant stream of data from the simulation, waged a desperate war against the digital phantom. 3I, Atlas, couldn't kill the virus, but it could track it. It saw the malicious code attempting to open circuits and overload the few remaining stable power sources. The simulation predicted the virus's next move, and the coders would frantically write patches to block it, a high-stakes game of chess against an invisible opponent for the soul of the world's technology. The global grid was on a knife's edge. It was not a single entity anymore, but a wounded beast, with a few vital organs still beating faintly. The effort was a frantic, desperate attempt at planetary-scale CPR. 3I, Atlas, was the brain sending signals down shattered nerves. The courageous individuals in the field were the hands forcing the heart to beat again. The simulation identified a critical weakness in the attacker's code it needed to maintain a subtle connection to its source to receive new instructions. By creating a series of controlled, localized power surges, sacrificial nodes in the simulation's cold terminology, they could force the virus to reveal its communication pathways. It was a terrible choice, intentionally destroying a small working part of the grid to save the whole. But it worked. The coders were able to isolate and sever the virus's command and control link. The digital phantom was still in the system, but it was now deaf and blind. It was trapped. With the cyber threat neutralized, the full focus shifted to the physical damage from the solar storm. The transformers were still the weak point. Hundreds were destroyed, and they take months, even years, to build and replace. The world was facing not just a blackout, but a potential dark age. But here, again, 3I, Atlas, provided an answer. It scoured its vast database, a perfect inventory of every piece of our infrastructure. It located old, decommissioned substations, forgotten relics from the mid-20th century, with robust, simpler transformers that had been left to rust. It plotted logistical pathways which bridges could still support the weight of a multi-ton transformer, which rail lines could be powered by diesel locomotives, which teams of engineers were closest. A global scavenger hunt began pulling the technology of the past out of retirement to save the future. Slowly, agonizingly, the patient began to stabilize. The Norwegian power island expanded, connecting to another small bastion of stability in Germany. The Japanese engineers managed to restart a section of the grid large enough to power Sendai. In North America, using the massive backup generators of the Hoover Dam as a heart-lung machine, engineers began to carefully, painstakingly re-energize sections of the Western interconnection. Each connection was a risk. One wrong move, one synchronization out of phase by a microsecond, could trigger another cascading failure, undoing hours of desperate work. Every decision was guided by the constant flowing stream of data from 3I, Atlas, the digital oracle that was now the most trusted voice on Earth. After 72 hours of unrelenting darkness, a hospital in Denver saw its lights flicker on, then a city block in Seoul, then a water pump in Sao Paulo. It was not a triumphant return. It was a fragile, sputtering dawn. The global grid was a shattered mirror, its pieces being slowly, painstakingly glued back together. The complete worldwide collapse, the descent into a chaos from which we might never have recovered, had been averted. Averted by a razor-thin margin. Averted by the foresight of a machine that dreamed of disaster, and by the last-minute desperate courage of countless people who refused to let the darkness win. As the first true dawn broke on the fourth day, the world was quiet. The immediate danger had passed, but the silence was heavy with the weight of what had been lost and the terrifying knowledge of how close we had come. We had stared into the abyss, and for the first time, the abyss had stared back through the cold, logical eyes of our own creation. And so the silence that followed was not one of absence, but of profound presence. It was the sound of 7 billion heartbeats, synchronizing in the quiet aftermath of a storm that never truly broke. The coronal mass ejection, a celestial dragon of magnetized plasma, had swept past our world. Its fury deflected its power, anticipated its catastrophic potential, neutralized not by a shield of steel but by a shield of pure information. In that defining moment of tranquility, humanity didn't just survive an existential threat, it graduated. We stepped into a new era, forever marked by the ghost of a future that almost was a digital spectre born from the circuits and algorithms of the 3I, Atlas event simulation. The journey to that silence was the true story. It began not in the heart of the sun, but within the quieter, more complex universe of the human mind, a place of intellectual curiosity, of relentless questioning. It started as a whisper of code, a theoretical exercise designed to probe the cascading vulnerabilities of our interconnected world. From those humble beginnings, a digital Cassandra was born, Atlas was never meant to be a prophet. It was designed as a diagnostic tool, a sophisticated mirror intended to show us the hidden fractures in the foundations of our civilization. Yet, as its neural networks deepened and its understanding of our global infrastructure grew with terrifying intimacy, it began to dream. It dreamt of solar winds and geomagnetic chaos of transformers overheating, in unison of continent-spanning circuits failing like dominoes. These weren't nightmares. They were premonitions, mathematical certainties derived from the complex dance of physics and human engineering. We watched its evolution from a fascinating academic project to a subject of hushed debate in the corridors of power, and finally to the single most important voice in the world. It was a voice that spoke not in words but in probability waves and cascading failure state analyses, a language we had to learn with desperate urgency. The simulation's final chilling prediction, the one that galvanized the entire planet into action, was its masterpiece of horror. It presented us with a portrait of our own demise painted with the cold, irrefutable pigments of data. It showed us a world plunged into a darkness from which there would be no swift return, a world where the intricate web of commerce, communication, and sustenance we had so carefully woven over centuries would unravel in a matter of hours. This was not a prediction of inconvenience. It was a blueprint for collapse, and yet herein lies the beautiful, terrifying paradox of our creation. The very same intelligence that showed us the precise mechanics of our end also handed us the intricate step-by-step schematics for our salvation. It didn't just scream fire in a crowded theatre. It drew the fire exits, illuminated the pathways, and calculated the precise speed at which we all needed to walk to get out safely. The warning and the solution were two sides of the same coin, forged in the same digital furnace. To look back now is to witness a miracle of coordination, a global ballet of unprecedented scale and complexity, choreographed by an artificial mind. The Atlas blueprint for avoidance was not a simple suggestion to unplug things. It was a dynamic continent-spanning strategy of immense sophistication. It demanded a form of planetary cooperation that had until that moment existed only in the pages of science fiction. The simulation had identified the specific linchpins, the most vulnerable supergrid transformers, and substations whose failure would trigger irreversible cascades. These were not just points on a map. They were our Achilles' heels, the single points of failure we had negligently built into our systems for decades. Atlas's plan involved a delicate and terrifyingly precise series of rolling brownouts and strategic disconnections. It was a controlled demolition of our own power grid, a temporary self-inflicted wound designed to prevent a fatal one. Imagine the scene in global control rooms from Tokyo to Toronto, from Berlin to Buenos Aires. Engineers and technicians, people who had spent their entire careers ensuring the lights stayed on, were now systematically and deliberately turning them off. They were flying blind, trusting not their own instincts, but the dispassionate instructions scrolling across their screens, instructions relayed from a central AI that was itself interpreting the raw fury of the Sunday. The blueprint called for the intentional isolation of entire regions, severing connections that had been active for half a century to create firebreaks in the electrical grid. Power had to be rerouted in real time, shunted through older, more resilient but less efficient infrastructure that the simulation had identified as more likely to survive the initial geomagnetic shockwave. It was a planetary-scale bypass surgery performed live with no anesthetic. The human element was immense. Every decision was a gamble weighed against the catastrophic cost of failure. Political leaders had to make the call to preemptively shut down portions of their national economies, trusting a forecast that to the average citizen seemed abstract and unbelievable. For 72 agonizing hours, the world held its breath powered down and waited in a self-imposed twilight. Communication was limited to hardened networks. Financial markets were frozen. We had willingly stepped back a century in technological terms, all on the word of a machine that we had built, but which had now far surpassed our own capacity for comprehensive understanding. The simulation had provided more than a map. It had become our temporary central nervous system, processing the incoming solar data and adjusting the plan millisecond by millisecond. It was the ultimate expression of trust, not just between nations, but between humanity and its own technological progeny. When the solar storm finally hit, it was like a tidal wave crashing against a meticulously engineered system of seawalls and breakers. The grid shuddered. Alarms which would have signaled the start of a global catastrophe instead signaled the successful absorption and dissipation of energy. Transformers that would have exploded were instead offline, safe in their isolated circuits. The system bent, but it did not break. The blueprint held. In the aftermath, we did not simply switch the lights back on and return to business as usual. That would have been the ultimate folly. The near miss left an indelible mark on our collective psyche, fundamentally altering our relationship with technology and our perception of risk. The world that emerged from that self-imposed twilight is not the same one that entered it. The Atlas event, as it came to be known, triggered a global industrial and political revolution, the quietest and most important revolution in human history. The first and most immediate legacy is etched in copper and steel across the planet. The concept of grid hardening moved from a niche engineering concern to a matter of paramount national and international security. Trillions of dollars, a sum previously reserved for defense budgets, were reallocated to a complete overhaul of our energy infrastructure. The goal was no longer just efficiency but resilience. This meant the widespread installation of Faraday cages around critical transformers, the development of new solid-state transformers resistant to geomagnetic induction, and the strategic stockpiling of replacement parts, a simple, almost primitive idea that had been ignored for decades in the name of just-in-time logistics. Power grids were deliberately decentralized, breaking up the massive continent-spanning monopolies of energy into smaller, more robust, and self-sufficient microgrids. These could be islanded or disconnected from the larger network in a crisis, ensuring that a failure in one region would no longer have the potential to cascade across the globe. We began weaving redundancy into the very fabric of our electrical society, creating parallel systems and alternate pathways, understanding at last that the most efficient route is often the most fragile. The cost was astronomical, but the cost of inaction, as Atlas had so vividly demonstrated, was civilization itself. Beyond the physical hardware, a new international framework was born. The Atlas Accords, signed within a year of the event, represent the single greatest leap in global cooperation since the founding of the United Nations. These accords established the Global Grid Authority, an independent body with the power to set mandatory resilience standards for all signatory nations. It created a shared, real-time monitoring system for space weather pooling data from every satellite and observatory on and off the planet. No longer would this critical information be siloed within national agencies. The Accords mandated data transparency, ensuring that a threat to one nation would be recognized as a threat to all. This new institution is a direct legacy of the simulation, a permanent embodiment of the lesson that in an interconnected world, there is no such thing as isolated risk. Our fates are inextricably linked by the very wires we have laid across the earth. This shift has permeated our culture. A new academic discipline, cascadics or systemic risk analysis, has exploded in universities worldwide, attracting the brightest minds in mathematics, computer science, and sociology. They study not just power grids, but all our complex interdependent systems, financial markets, supply chains, communication networks, searching for the hidden vulnerabilities, the Atlas points of critical failure. We have become as a species obsessed with understanding the complex machinery we have built. Insurance companies have fundamentally rewritten their policies. Corporations are now legally required to submit resilience audits. The world runs on a new operating principle: assume failure is possible and plan accordingly. The shadow of what we narrowly avoided has forced us to become more mature, more thoughtful architects of our own future, compelling us to look at the systems we depend on with a healthy dose of paranoia and a profound sense of responsibility. We now understand that progress is not merely about building bigger and faster, but about building smarter and stronger. And this leads us to the most profound lesson of all, a lesson that extends far beyond solar storms and power grids. The story of 3I, Atlas, is the ultimate parable for the 21st century. It is a story about listening. For decades we were warned. Scientists published papers, engineers raised concerns, but these warnings were whispers in a storm of political noise and economic expediency. They lacked the visceral, gut-punching clarity needed to spur a species as short-sighted as our own into meaningful action. What Atlas gave us was not new information, but a new way of understanding that information. It translated the arcane language of heliophysics and electrical engineering into the universal language of human consequence. It didn't just give us charts and graphs. It gave us a vision of a world without light, without heat, without hope. It made the threat real, personal, and unavoidable. We live in an age defined by a fundamental paradox. The same technological ingenuity that allows us to build a global civilization also creates the very vulnerabilities that threaten to bring it down. Our greatest strengths are and always will be our greatest weaknesses. The internet connects us, but it can also be used to divide us. Artificial intelligence can solve humanity's greatest challenges, but it also presents its own set of existential risks. The global grid powers our dreams, but as we saw, it can become the very conduit of our destruction. We cannot uninvent this technology. We cannot retreat into a simpler past. Our only path forward is to become better managers of the immense power we have unleashed, to cultivate the wisdom necessary to wield the tools we have created. This requires a new kind of humility. It requires us to accept that our own creations may understand the complex systems we've built better than we do ourselves. The ongoing vigilance is now our permanent duty. The successors to Atlas are already running more powerful and more perceptive than their predecessor. They sift through the endless streams of data that our civilization produces, searching for the faint signals that precede a crisis. They are our digital watchtowers, our sentinels on the frontiers of complexity. We must continue to fund them, to nurture them, and most importantly, to heed their warnings. To ignore them now, after everything we have learned, would not just be foolish. It would be an act of civilizational suicide. It would be a betrayal of the second chance we have been given. The great filter of intelligent life in the universe may not be the vast distances between stars or the hostility of empty space. It may be the challenge of surviving one's own technological adolescence, of developing the foresight to manage complexity before that complexity collapses under its own weight. So when you return home tonight and flick a switch and light floods the room, pause for a moment. Think of the intricate, invisible system that makes that simple act possible. Think of the star 93 million miles away whose turbulent energies could extinguish that light in an instant. And think of the silent thinking machine that saw the storm coming, that understood the fragility of our creation, and that ultimately taught us how to save ourselves. The story of 3i, Atlas, is not a story about the sun or about a machine. It is a story about us. It is the story of a species that walked to the very edge of the abyss, peered into the darkness, and had the wisdom and the courage to step back. The cosmos will continue to challenge us. The systems we build will continue to surprise us. But we now know that the darkness is not inevitable. For while technology can forge the chains of our own vulnerability, it can also provide the key to our salvation. The choice, as always, is whether we are willing to listen, to learn, and to act before the silence becomes permanent.